A warm-hearted welcome to the first video of the series Cultural Dimensions. As a novelty, you can find all the foreign words described briefly in the description of the video. Today, one of the first theories will be presented which tried to compare culture and originated in the United States. It came to light through the cooperation of Clyde K. Kluckhohn, Fred L. Strothbeck, and Florence Rockwood Kluckhohn. The book, which originated from that work and was published after the death of Kluckhohn, is named Variations in Value Orientations. Kluckhohn achieved a PhD in anthropology at the University of Harvard in the year 1936. He taught there between 1935 and 1960, and in 1946, as an addition, taught social anthropology. I couldn't find further information about Florence Rockwood Kluckhohn, neither about Fred L. Strothbeck on the internet. The book and its theory was the first attempt to match basic values with cultures and therefore make them comparable. The basic assumption was that a certain number of problems do exist for humans, and you have to find solutions for them at every given moment. This reveals that there is a limited number of value orientation, but there are several possibilities of problem solution. Therefore, the selection of a problem-solving strategy depends on the given culture and its context. That is how the book defined it. Value orientations are complex but definitely pattern principles resulting from the transactional interplay of three analytically distinguishable elements of the evaluative process: the cognitive, the affective, and the directive elements, which give order and direction to the ever-flowing string of human acts and thoughts as these relate to the solution of common human problems. These principles are variable from culture to culture, but are, we maintain, variable only in the ranking patterns of component parts which are themselves cultural universals. That means as much as the value orientations, or equivalent to cultural dimensions, represent principles which emerge through the mutual exchange of appraisal processes of mental, emotional, and behavioral elements. These arrange and lead that process and stand in a relation to the solution of these general human problems. Naturally, as we already learned, the solution is codependent of the context and varies in pattern of its rank of the given culture. These are universals, norms, and rules which are being used in every culture in its cultural circle. One could say that Kluckhohn and Strothbeck's cultural dimension represent human problems which have to be solved daily, depending on our environment we focus on. There are 5 different dimensions or problems to be differentiated. Number 1, human nature. Number 2, man, nature. Number 3, time. Number 4, activity. And number 5, relational. The human nature, according to Kluckhohn and Strothbeck, consists of 3 different entities. A human could be evil, a mixture of good and evil, and solely good. This creates consequences for a particular culture on how people treat each other in concern of these entities. If we are referring solely to good and evil, that may result in the following types of society of trust and society of distrust. In a society of distrust, strangers are addressed in a self-contained way, and own weaknesses are kept in secret. In societies of trust, showing your own weaknesses aren't seen negative. Others, and you are, well disposed as a basic attitude, and a helping hand is expected from your counterpart. People who are part of a society of distrust, for example Germans, know that their behavior isn't intended to be evil or hostile if the interaction partner is behaving more distanced and reserved, but should be perceived more as a way of getting to know the stranger without presenting oneself or give away private information. If an individual of the society of trust and one of the other should encounter each other, for example a German woman and a Brazilian guy, this could lead to problems of understanding. The distant behavior of the German woman could be perceived as hostile and malicious because she doesn't respond to his friendly and open way, but acts reserved instead. At the same time, the open and usually more emotional way of the Brazilian guy could be perceived as superficial, clumsy, and under circumstances as invasive, because he involves her in his private circle without knowing anything about her. Ergo, these small differences could give birth to misunderstanding. The mixture of good and evil is ought to be a hybrid of both extremes. You may call it neutral. In general, Kluckhohn and Strothbeck assume that the exclusivity of good and evil doesn't exist in that form in humans. That is why they made another division in mutable and immutable. That may result in cultures where they think human nature is mutable, for example in re-education measures for offenders. On the other hand, in cultures where immutability is assumed, people think the re-educational measures have no effect on the individual and human behavior is perceived as a fixed trait, so punishment is carried out in a firmer way. The second problem is the relation between human and nature and is divided again in three different divisions. Humans are dominated by nature, live in harmony with it, or dominated themselves. If in the culture human is dominated by nature, he lives in the belief that he can influence nothing and is succumbed to his destiny. As a result of that, there will be no effort to improve the current situation in any way. An example for that are the Spanish-American shepherds, who as an alteration or catastrophe in relation to their land, herd, or well-being occurs, will succumb to the situation and hope for a positive outcome of their destiny. A culture living in harmony with nature perceives every change as a disturbance of the equilibrium. There is no separation of the human or nature concept, and a harmony is ought to be achieved. An example is the Chinese Feng Shui, which refers to the alignment of interior in an energetical way to achieve a harmony of the human being and its environment. More examples are the Indians of Navajo or the American Mormons who, as a way of life, are trying to reach the whole of nature, human and supernature as a unit. If humans dominate nature, there are precautions and forecasts to be met to lessen or evade outcomes of catastrophes. The goal is to overcome problems, there's a general orientation to technology, and the force of nature is ought to be mastered and harnessed. Examples for that are most of the Western cultures. The third problem consists of the temporal orientation of culture. It refers to assumed dimensions in Decline of the West of Spengler. It proposes a timeless, traditionalist, and relatively living in the present orientation. One that refers to the preservation and restoration of tradition, and finally, one that orientates itself to the realizable future. All of these three orientations do exist in every culture in the form of rank patterns and decline until the last ranks in their importance. Kluckhohn and Strothbeck assume their dimensions as past, present, and future. In a culture mainly orientated in the past, traditions are important and cared for. For all tasks, generally speaking, a lot of time is spent and no one hurries. Change and innovation only can be realized as plans if they correspond with traditions. Examples are Iran, India, the Far East, and East Asia. England still has aristocratical and traditional parts of culture, and France still holds onto their values of liberté, égalité, and fraternité from the French Revolution until this day. Cultures with an orientation in the present are living in it. Their spontaneous dates, relationships, and positive sympathy is more important than plans. Here, future is perceived as vague and unplannable. These values are shared by private persons as by institutions in the same manner. Good examples are the Spanish and Mexican culture with a siesta, because they focus on the momentary relaxation. A future orientation results in time being divided in sequences. Punctuality and the abidance of appointments are important cornerstones. The past is past, and the future can be changed while innovations are perceived as positive. The word change from the USA is a good example for that. It refers to a transformation while keeping the value orientation, and the future is seen as bigger and brighter. In the GFR, it is referred as precaution mentality, which, for example, consists of higher rates of insurances, environmentalism, sustainability, appointments are made beforehand, and vacation is planned already at the beginning of the year. Concluding, we may shed light on that these aren't absolute orientations, and the manifestation always stands in relative terms to other cultures. For example, the time orientation of Spain in comparison to Germany. The fourth dimension is the orientation of activity. It is based on a philosophical view of Apollonian and Dionysian. It varies independently from the other problems and has the self-expression in activity as a foundation. Being in becoming, and doing are its subdivisions. In being, as in the present orientation, the moment counts. You want to experience as much as possible, the future is unplannable, and relationships are more important than performance. Literally speaking, you work in the moment and try to gain as much experience as possible. As a result, it is assumed that performance isn't measurable objectively and is a spontaneous expression of activity. Examples are the Mexican siesta and in general cultures from Africa or Latin America. A culture focused on doing is likely to dominate nature. There's a general orientation for the future which is planned and ought to be met, whereas the focus lies on a successful execution of a task, and the provided performance in the end is of utter importance. These cultures assume a measurable performance which results in punishments for failures and gratification for success. In psychology, this is called motivation via external incentives, for example, money or promotion. So performance comes from the urge of activity which is measurable by defined standards and leads to the appraisal of individuals by themselves and others. A very good example is the performance orientation of the American society. In becoming, one is in harmony with nature. The personal development is in the center of attention, and you want to perform and achieve a lot. An equilibrium between being and doing is strived for, and possibilities of development are most important. The goal is to develop all aspects of self until an integrated whole. As an example, you may view the hippie movement of 1968, when they focused on the expansion of consciousness and to live in harmony with mankind and the environment. The last problem to be solved is the relation between humans. This refers more to a division as an analytical concept than a general harsh system differentiation. That is why there is more a differentiation in and between systems than only between them. It is important that societies and their subgroups regard all three principles. That means that every culture has to create a rank pattern of those principles. We differentiate in individualistic cultures and collectivistic cultures. The last one is divided into linear and collateral. In an individualistic culture, the particular individual stands in the epicenter and has narcissistic interests. The individual is independent from groups and society, its relationships are vague, it has only responsibilities for itself and at large for its family circle or nuclear family. The society respects the autonomy of each, and the individual shall obtain its own goals, prestige, and wealth. The majority of the Western cultures have a focus on individualistic orientation, whereas through globalization, other cultures approximate themselves to individualism. In collectivistic cultures, the group is generally speaking the center. Important values are reliability, willingness to cooperate, adaptation, compatibility with and in a group. For a linear collectivistic society, a temporal continuity and a trend to an established hierarchy is of utter importance. Individuals are biological and culturally related over time, and fulfillment of the role expectation orientates itself at the position in the hierarchy. Examples are that in the Korean language, addressing the interlocutor orientates at the age, the sex, heritage, profession, wealth, and intensity of the acquaintance. Another example is the order of seating at tables in Japan. The highest rank sits in the middle, while the graduation, people with a lower rank, occurs left and right from the middle. In collateral collectivistic cultures exists a temporal discontinuity hierarchy. You may say a temporal change of it. This is referred to as the equality of all participants. At birth, you become a member of a group, you gain support, you are loyal to it, and you have intensive interpersonal relationships. As a prototype, you may use biological sibling relationships. The goal is to ensure the well-being of the extended group. An example is the extended family by Navajo Indians. These are all 5 dimensions assumed by Kluckern and Strobeck. I hope I could shed a positive light onto them and increase the interest for the other theories. The only critique of their dimensions was that they aren't empirically backed and represent solely a theoretical construct. That is all for today's video. Other will follow. I wish you a nice day. Thanks for watching, and until the next time, here at iCat.